Hello and welcome to In Conversation with an international civil servant, an international diplomat, a writer of books, a scholar of the Mahabharata, otherwise that book would not have been written. Then he decides to come home and his name happens to be Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor, welcome home. Has it been a good homecoming?
It's been a mixed homecoming, Saeed. We've had our ups and our downs. But I have to say that it's wonderful to be home. Having spent so much of my life living and working outside India, the opportunity to make a contribution to my own country by being part of the great adventure that is India is something that I really am very, very privileged to have.
There's a rumor all over the country that every now and again you wake up in the middle of the night and you scream, IPL, IPL. Surely that's not true.
No, that's not true. That was such a silly thing blown out of all proportion by your wonderful tribe in the media. And I think that more than enough ink has been spilled and footage wasted.
Right, you are blaming our tribe for. But why would the tribe be against you?
Now there you've got absolutely as many, shall we say, answers as there are people. All I can say is that having spent 3 decades in international service, in the course of which I must have given interviews to every single serious media organization in the world, whether print or radio or television, from CNN to BBC's Hard Talk to assorted European stations, etc., and indeed to some of the Indian media as well at that time, I was somewhat bewildered to suddenly find myself an object of controversy, because when you spend 3 decades without ever having been accused of having said the wrong thing or put your foot wrong or said anything that was liable to distortion, which in my profession was very important because of the UN, the things one said or did could have had a terrible impact on the work of the organization.
It could be.
I had to conclude there was something that went beyond, shall we say, a fair reporting of my remarks.
You know, there's an Urdu poet who you will not be familiar with, who wrote a line, "Hai aib bada usme, jise kuch hunar aave." There's a great fault in that person who has a skill. So, because then you inspire ire, jealousies, you know?
And that's for you to say, Saeed, not for me. All I can say is that I also accept a certain amount of responsibility. I mean, I know that some of my earlier remarks omitted awareness of 2 realities. One is ours is a multilingual country, that everything you say from any position of authority is liable to be mistranslated, even in good faith. So one doesn't crack jokes which may work in, shall we say, light-hearted English language humor but translate badly elsewhere. And secondly, one also, I think, has to be wise enough to realize that there are some things one simply doesn't assume the audience will get in the same spirit in which it's being uttered. So the whole logic that...
In fact, you thought that your statement about cattle class would be taken for that, namely a joke.
Well, to begin with, the words were used in the question asked by the journalist. The question was, Mr. Minister, next time will you travel cattle class? This was in reference to our austerity drive. So I was actually repeating a phrase he had used, but in my case, to be quite honest, I had heard that phrase so commonly used in the Western world for the preceding 2 or 3 decades that I didn't realize it was not in common currency here. And so when I said what I said, A, people took it badly. B, various people, somewhat more maliciously, implied that I had dismissed all economy class travelers as cattle, whereas in fact the very expression is not an attack on the travelers but on the airlines for herding us in like cattle. But all of this, of course, was further compounded by translation.
Your remark was about cattle, not about the people.
No, my remark was about the airlines. In any case, the joke. I mean, one of the things I discovered is the great importance, Saeed, of remembering that the success of a joke, to quote Shakespeare, lies not in the tongue of the teller but in the ear of the hearer. What really matters is not what you intend to say, but how people have heard it. And that was a hugely valuable lesson, learned in a rather painful way.
Have you therefore realized the larger lesson that you may have become a little bit of a misfit, having lived there for 30 years, to be regrafted here was going to be a little painful.
No, I mean, the pain one has to take. I mean,
Yes.
but the misfit argument I reject utterly for a number of reasons. First of all, I've stayed engaged with my country throughout. I have 12 books to show for it. I'd like anyone to pick up any of my books about India and say that this is written by somebody who doesn't understand this country or has got the facts wrong or is... I mean, no one has ever made such a criticism. There are people who don't like what I have to say, but no one can allege that I have somehow been out of touch with the India I'm writing about. So the first and most important fact is that I have remained engaged with India and there has been no change in that. So I don't find any difficulty in fitting in. The second and more important fact is that I am Indian. I've actually, shall we say, earned the privilege of being Indian by having turned down other options. I was born abroad. I could have taken a foreign passport without any difficulty, without even applying for it. It is still in theory a matter of right for me, and I have said no. I've always wanted to be Indian. I was proud of my nationality, proud of my country, proud to serve the United Nations as an Indian, proud to bring whatever little I could bring to my country and my country's image in the world. And so all of that, I think, mean that I do feel that I have a rightful claim to being here. And the ultimate
No
point,
one is challenging
and the
that.
ultimate point, Saeed, is that misfit or not, I won a very free and fair election, and I won it with a very, very handsome margin, the best in 30 years in my constituency, defeating the communists who had held the seat the 2 previous times. So I think that I can truly say that I have earned some credibility without needing to be dismissed with words like misfit.
Are you working for the state assembly elections now?
Of course I will be. I campaigned extensively for the panchayat and municipal elections a few months ago, and I'm proud to say I think I made a fairly positive impact with my contribution, and I'm looking forward to doing the same in the assembly elections. Look, the fact is our politics is not exactly unfamiliar ground to NRIs. Jawaharlal Nehru was an NRI, Mahatma Gandhi was an NRI, Jayaprakash Narayan was an NRI, Ram Manohar Lohia was an NRI. Our country is full, our history is full of very many distinguished politicians and statesmen who spent a decent chunk of their lives abroad before coming back to make a contribution. In the case of Mahatma Ji, he came to India after as many decades abroad, I think, as I had.
Mahatma Gandhi, I think, came back. He went out in Indian and he came back in Indian. But I think about Nehru, there can be a phase of transition. For instance, Mrs. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit once told me a story that when Bhai, she used to call him Bhai, when Bhai came back to England and found that father had given her an English governess, he was very cross. He says, I said, why? She said, because in those days, the British aristocracy had French governesses. That was your first prime minister of independent India. So therefore, this misfit idea that it was not, you should not have taken it the way, that way. What it means is that you live in another country for 30 years, you start to joke in a certain way, and suddenly you find that that is not getting communication. There is a communication gap.
Again, Saeed, I lived in many countries and I worked and spoke in many countries. And so I had no reason particularly to assume that just as I had to say something that would be heard in the same way in Germany, in Singapore, in China and in New York, that the same kind of, shall we say, care in choosing my words would not work in India. Of course, humor is particularly difficult to translate. I mean, the fact that there are still people in this country who have been convinced that I call them cattle is deeply wounding to me as well, and I feel sorry about that.
What was the thing about Nehru and Gandhi which they thought was very irreverent?
No, that was not irreverence. That was, with Gandhiji, I simply said that I think we should work on his birthday. It's the best way to pay tribute to him. We shouldn't take a holiday. On Nehru, it was not a question of irreverence. In summarizing a seminar that I was chairing as Minister of State for External Affairs at the Indian Council of World Affairs, I summarized accurately and comprehensively the criticisms made by the speaker. That was my job as chairman. But it was decided that this would apparently merit banner headlines in the country that Tharoor criticizes Nehru, which of course I had not done.
But supposing
these are the
you
sorts of
had,
things.
supposing you had, are we losing that the art of discussion? I mean,
But then isn't that for the media to respond? Why did the media choose to make a sort of
yeah,
balance?
well, let us.
It is the editor who makes that a front page banner headline who has to ask what is the point he's trying to say. that somehow
here you have
that
Amartya
lèse
Sen.
majesté has been committed? Well, what was the? But the fact is, a huge storm was created. I had to have the ministry opened on a Sunday to respond to these charges, and I'm somewhat bewildered by both the misrepresentation and the song and dance that was made about it in the media. It was a purely media controversy.
Shashi, well, all the gaffes, that alleged gaffes that you may have made, you think are milder than at least one cannot place at your door the complaint that you mixed up the Portuguese speech with the Indian speech.
No, look, I mean, this whole business of our obsession, again, I'm coming back to even the terms of your question. What is a gaffe? I mean, after all, for example, I was accused of a gaffe in using the rather banal diplomatic word interlocutor, which simply means the person you're talking to. If I'm talking to you right now, I'm your interlocutor. And that became headline news in the country for 3 days. I mean, who makes this a gaffe except the ignorance of the journalists? The fact is the word was correctly used by me, as I tend to use words correctly. And what is more, the Ministry of Home Affairs has now adopted the word to refer to the people who are traveling to Kashmir and talking to Kashmiris, which is what an interlocutor does. He or she talks. So I just want to stress that I don't believe that any of the things that I've said or done can be fairly characterized that way. As to other things, I mean, the fact is that every minister in the government has his or her strengths and must be respected for those strengths.
Tell me the kind of Mr. Krishna read a speech which was not meant for him. Has, in your diplomatic experience, do you remember an incident which could be, where the humor might be communicated in this program?
Now, there's lots of diplomatic incidents
for instance,
lend humor. Some of them can be quite nasty. I remember the Iraqi ambassador attacking the Kuwaiti ambassador at the time that Saddam Hussein had marched into Kuwait, and calling him a pygmy. And this resulted in a great deal of, he's a short stature gentleman. He objected, but the African countries objected, saying pygmies are a tribe in Africa and you cannot use it as an insult. Whereupon the Iraqi ambassador, quick on his feet, responded, I apologize unreservedly for calling the Kuwaiti ambassador pygmy. He is in fact a dwarf. This actually happened at the United Nations. So there can be nasty humor, and there can sometimes be, of course, more gentle and well-mannered humor.
To come back on the people's obsession with this IPL thing, why was it dragged? Why do you think was it dragged? And if it was dragged, why are you out of a job then?
No, I mean, the fact is very simply that when any issue becomes enough of a media controversy to be seized upon by the opposition, as this particular issue was, at a time when the budget had to be presented by the government, it was simply untenable for me as a minister to become a locus of this sort of thing. I mean, if the same controversy had arisen 2 weeks later or 2 months earlier, I dare say that it would have been over and done with, and there would have been no need for me to offer my resignation. But you cannot, during a budget session in a parliamentary system, the budget session is ultimately what determines whether a government will rise or fall if it can pass its budget. You simply don't stand there as a lightning rod, and as you may recall, the parliament was even paralyzed for a day by the opposition on this issue. I was not allowed to speak, to give my point of view. The whole experience, to me...
Are you generally disgusted?
That particular experience was indeed deeply, deeply dismaying. Now, with the passage of time and with the very same opposition people who shouted against me in the well of the House, coming to me in the corridors and saying how they didn't really mean any of it, I've begun to realize that politics is also a bit of theatre. You know, we speak about our parliamentary democracy with a full awareness that it's run by human beings, and human beings by definition are flawed. But even I was not totally prepared for some of the cynicism behind these things. Having said that, it's behind me. I don't particularly want to talk about it because the only thing that bothers me is that anyone should ever leave a taint on a reputation for integrity and probity that I've built up all my life. You know, when we speak of things like corruption, the corruption is the misuse of public office for private gain. In this particular incident, there was neither misuse of public office
This is the way it was being painted.
But how? I mean, the fact is my ministry does not issue licenses to cricketers. It does not allocate flats to cricket captains or whatever. My ministry and my ministerial position had nothing whatsoever to do with my desire to steer a team to my home state, which I still believe I was justified in doing. And in any case, there was neither misuse of public office nor any personal gain. And for this reason, I think that the issue really should be dead and buried, which it was until you raised it after all.
Tell me. You were Minister of State for External Affairs, and you did go to the Gulf, and you did sort of study that area. Even otherwise, as from the United Nations vantage point, you knew the area fairly well. What do you think is going on there?
Well, now there's a conversation I'd much rather have than the one we've been having so far, because that's frankly the kind of thing I thought we'd be talking about. We are looking at a part of the world where, and it's not the Gulf, it's really North Africa at the moment where the problems have started, which could spread, but the Gulf so far, with the exception of Bahrain, has not really been touched. But the issue is a combination of four factors. First of all, rather long-standing and autocratic regimes, which have really seen no change for quite some time. Gaddafi in power for 40 years, Mubarak for almost 30, Zainul Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia for more than 20. You've got a second factor, which is the demographic bulge, a tremendous youth increase in population, lots of people in their late teens, early 20s who don't have work, which leads me to the third point, the economic transformations which have left large numbers of people behind and the lack of job opportunities for them. And finally, the fourth point, the issue of the information revolution, the fact that you can watch on Al Jazeera what's happening in a country otherwise far away. You can exchange information about it on SMS, on mobile phone. And if you belong to the 10% of the elite that have access to the internet, then you have Facebook and Twitter and all these other means of generating social networking.
But Twitter, Shashi, I've been given to understand, was very much at the bottom of the agitation in Iran earlier and now in Tunis. So therefore Twitter and Facebook are becoming fairly common.
No, that's it. I think that when people tend to exaggerate a little bit the impact of these social networking media. The fact is that they are there, they're useful, they do positive things, but at the same time, internet penetration across most of the Arab world is only about 10%. I'd be surprised if it were 15. So that means that the number of people who can actually receive Twitter messages. No, I'm referring to the Arab world. India is also about 15 today. But India is growing steadily and has been. It grows in such a way that we are seriously expecting that by 2030, a majority of Indians will have access to the internet.
Supposing when majority of Indians will have access, supposing you Twitter, is it possible to link up from Kanyakumari to Kashmir on an issue?
Yes and no, because in India we also have the complication of language. Unless
English,
you have
English.
Well, English will again reach only a small percentage of the population. I'd love to know what the census comes up with for the languages spoken, because now they're at least asking this question. Earlier censuses would simply ask you what your mother tongue is. So I, for example, was never counted amongst the 2% of Indians who are English speakers, whereas I think my English is not bad, so I should have been counted.
Hopeless.
So there you are, you see. I mean, this is the problem. In my view, we need an accurate count. But even if the figure turns out to be somewhere above 10%, it's unlikely to be higher than 20. And so you're still looking at a relatively narrow stratum of Indian society that you can reach in any one language.
No, this is I've learned something, because I thought that these Twitter and Facebook had been very effective in Iran and effective and therefore the question was being asked, why can't, if Twitter can create Tahrir Square, why can't we have it in Kabul, and why can't it be done more in other places?
Yeah, I mean, somebody will have to do a more detailed study, Saeed, but my view is that Tahrir Square, the vast majority of people were brought there by the SMS mechanism and not by Twitter. I'm sure that some were there because they saw about this on Twitter or Facebook, but a large number of people were there who probably are not on Twitter. And that's certainly true of Tunisia as well. But in Tahrir Square, there was perhaps a disproportionate representation of the educated middle class, and maybe therefore the social networking media had a bit of an impact. But I would not suggest that it accounts for a majority of those present and protesting, shall we say.
You know, you've mentioned everything about the Middle East and North Africa and coming down to the Gulf. But you have not mentioned the Palestinian-Israeli issue. I think that is the tipping point. I mean, there are all these other factors. Plus, for instance, there is no agitation in Damascus. There's no uproar against the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran is not in a turmoil on that issue. Wherever the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the regime is in harmony with the street. That tipping point is not reached.
Well, Jordan might be a bit of an exception, because certainly there is some unrest, and Jordan is one of the countries that recognizes Israel. But the street is certainly less well disposed
It's
towards
not just a
Israel.
question of where do the regimes stand on the Arab-Palestinian issue. If you're seen
But
to be
Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya,
Saudis,
the issue simply didn't feature in any of the public demonstrations.
it didn't feature because we didn't see it. But it is the tipping point, I think. I believe that the Palestinian issue will, I mean, the Israelis must be watching it with great anxiety. The two regimes should be worried. One is Israel, the other is Saudi Arabia.
No, certainly those regimes should be concerned, and there are others as well, frankly. I think we have not yet heard the end of the story in Yemen. We don't know how Algeria will come out of all of this. I don't think that the phase of Arab unrest is by any means concluded as we speak. But having said that, Saudi Arabia runs a very powerful and effective administration. The Mukhbarat, I think, in some places will make sure that that dissent is effectively curbed. If Syria can keep itself quiet, even though surely some of these issues are in common there, unemployment, for example, then perhaps other countries can keep themselves quiet. It just depends. As recently as 2 months ago, you will not see many references to Libya as the next country likely to be troubled.
Libya is unique, in fact, of all these countries. Anyway, tell me, in your entire experience, and you've met so many world statesmen, both with Kofi Annan and other Secretary Generals, are they memorable? Some contacts of yours that you reflect on, which are part of your memoirs?
Well, my memoirs are a long way from being contemplated, let alone written. But yes, it's been a great privilege meeting lots of very, very extraordinary figures whom one normally would only ever see in the newspapers or the TV screens.
For instance?
Yasser Arafat, for example. I've spent quite some time with him, mainly alongside Kofi Annan. Very interesting character. Of course, over the years with advancing Parkinson's, which made his hand and lip tremble. Boris Yeltsin, whose capacity to knock down vodka had to be seen to be believed, because you have lunch with him at the Kremlin, those shots of vodka would disappear with remarkable rapidity. Tony Blair, who came across really like a bright undergraduate in a classroom when we were having a tea discussion at Downing Street. Fidel Castro, very surprising. He would listen attentively with almost the manner of the bright student in the class. You know, somebody pencil there, taking notes as other people spoke, very attentive eyes, quite curious for a man in his 80s. And so on. I mean, I really had the privilege of meeting large
Rahul?
Rahul, you mean as in Gandhi?
Yes.
Yes, I thought you meant Rahul as in Castro, and I was getting a little worried. I've met Rahul Castro very briefly. Rahul Gandhi I know somewhat better. I think he's a very, very impressive young political figure.
Do you see him as the next Prime Minister?
Well, I think that's really up to him and the party. One of the reasons that he has such tremendous appeal is that the popularity is very visible. You know, go to any campus that Rahul Gandhi has visited, and you should hear the oohs and the ahs that he's left behind. So I think people in our country will rise to power on the basis of the votes they can win, and I have no doubt that he is capable of winning a huge, huge popular mandate.
One final question now with your...
My eyes are completely going, so forgive me for doing that. Okay, go ahead. I know if I look like the DMK leader, I apologize.
Is something happening in the party? Is there a leadership change in the offing? Do you sense some settlement?
I'm not sure at all that the question isn't premature. I think right now we have a Prime Minister very much in office and power with a lot of experience and a great deal of national and international respect. And I think that right now he has signaled that there will be a cabinet reshuffle in May, and perhaps there will be some infusion of fresh blood or fresh
Could you come
faces.
back?
But that apart, I don't really think in terms of a transition right now.
What is your future?
Well, certainly the voters have given me another 3 years as Member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram. I have a lot of work to do there. The immediate future, there's a parliamentary session to attend. In fact, I'm getting late if I don't leave right now. And there is an election to be fought in Kerala.
Thank you very much, Shashi.
Thank you.